Hello and welcome to Umber Dreams Archives. I'm glad you've joined me, ready to slow down, breathe deeply, and let your thoughts drift back through the quiet corridors of time. This is your moment to leave the noise of the day behind, to step away from screens and deadlines and the relentless rush of now, and step gently onto the sun-baked plains of ancient Mesopotamia, where humanity once gathered with a single purpose, spoke with a single voice, and reached toward heaven with hands that shaped mud into mountains, brick into dreams, ambition into towers that scraped the sky. Here, in this space between past and present, we wander together through a story that lives somewhere between myth and memory, between the pages of sacred texts and the dust of archaeological digs. We stand before ruins that whisper of vanished grandeur, of cities that rose like miracles from the desert, of ziggurats that climbed toward the stars in defiance of limitation. We imagine the voices that once filled those ancient streets, speaking languages now silent for millennia, carrying bricks up endless staircases, building something that would challenge the very gods themselves. Each episode here isn't just about dates and ruins. It's not about memorizing kings or battles or the rise and fall of empires catalogued in textbooks. It's about the lives lived, the dreams dreamed, the ambitions that drove ordinary people to extraordinary acts. It's about the tower builders who mixed bitumen and reed, who hauled stone under relentless sun, who believed they could touch eternity. It's about the moment when unity shattered into confusion, when one language became many, when humanity scattered across the earth carrying fragments of a shared memory that would echo through every culture, every faith, every generation that followed. If you enjoy these quiet journeys through time, a like and subscribe help keep this channel alive, help us continue exploring together. But for now, you don't need to do anything but listen. In the beginning, there was Shinar, a flat expanse of alluvial plain stretched between two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, where the soil ran black and rich, where water flowed abundant and generous, where the first cities rose from nothing but human will and the gift of fertile earth. This was Mesopotamia, the land between rivers, the cradle of civilization, where farming gave way to writing, where villages became kingdoms, where humanity first learned to build not just for survival, but for glory. The people who lived here spoke one language. They shared one vocabulary of hope and fear, one syntax of prayer and poetry, one tongue that united farmer and priest, merchant and king. When they gathered in the marketplace, no translation was needed. When they sang, everyone understood the melody and the meaning. When they dreamed of greatness, they dreamed together, their ambitions flowing like the rivers themselves, carving channels through the landscape of human possibility. They had discovered something revolutionary. Not bronze, though they worked metal with skill. Not the wheel, though they used it to carry goods across vast distances. They had discovered bitumen, a black sticky substance that seeped from the earth like blood from a wound, that hardened like stone but could be shaped like clay, that could bind brick to brick with a strength that defied wind and rain and the passage of centuries. With bitumen and baked brick, they could build higher than anyone had built before. They could reach. Around them, the world was changing. Agriculture had freed humanity from the tyranny of constant hunting, constant gathering, constant movement. Surplus grain meant some could specialize, could become artisans or administrators, priests or planners. Cities had emerged, hives of human activity where thousands lived in proximity, where social hierarchies developed, where power concentrated in the hands of those who could organize labor and control resources. Uruk had risen first, its walls visible for miles across the flat plains. Ur had followed, its temples gleaming white under the desert sun. Eridu, considered by some the first city ever built, stood as a monument to human ingenuity. But something new was stirring, a collective ambition that transcended individual cities, individual kings, individual gods. The people of Shinar looked at what they had built and saw that it was good, but not yet great. They looked at the ziggurats, the stepped pyramids that each city had constructed as a link between earth and heaven, and thought, we can go higher. They looked at their unity, their shared language, their common purpose, and thought, together we are limitless. The idea began as all great ideas begin, as a whisper in the marketplace, a conversation between builders after the day's work was done, a dream shared over bread and beer in the cool evening air. What if we built something that would last forever? What if we created a monument so magnificent that our names would never be forgotten? What if we constructed a tower so tall that it touched the very realm of the gods themselves? The plan took shape slowly, deliberately, with the careful precision that characterized Mesopotamian culture. They would choose a site, gather materials, organize labor on a scale never before attempted. They would build not just for their own generation, but for all generations to come. They would create a city with a tower at its heart, a tower that would serve as both a physical structure and a spiritual statement. Humanity is capable of anything. And so they began to gather. From every corner of Shinar they came, bringing their skills and their strength, their faith and their ambition. Brickmakers and architects, labourers and engineers, priests who understood the sacred geometry of temple construction, and common workers who understood the weight of mud and straw. They came speaking the same language, united by a vision that seemed, in those early days, entirely achievable. The world before Babel was a world of possibility, of unity, of shared dreams and common goals. It was a world where humanity had not yet learned the lesson that would scatter them across the earth, had not yet discovered that some heights are not meant to be reached, that some ambitions carry within them the seeds of their own destruction. It was a world on the cusp of transformation, standing at a threshold it did not yet recognize, about to attempt something that would change the course of human history forever. In the spring of 1849, a young British diplomat named Austin Henry Layard stood in the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, his boots sinking into sand that had once been the foundation of empires. He had come to the mounds near Mosul, in what was then the Ottoman Empire, drawn by rumours of buried cities and forgotten kings. The local Arabs called the largest mound Birs Nimrud, though some whispered it had another name, older and more significant. Layard had already made remarkable discoveries at Nimrud and Nineveh, uncovering palaces and libraries that rewrote understanding of the ancient world. But nothing had prepared him for what lay beneath this particular tower of crumbling brick. The structure rose from the desert like a wounded giant, its sides scarred by millennia of wind and rain, its original height reduced to a fraction of what it must have been. Yet even in ruins, it commanded attention. The base measured over 200 feet on each side, the brick still bearing the marks of their makers, still showing traces of the bitumen that had held them together. Layard organised his workers, mostly local tribesmen who regarded the ruins with a mixture of reverence and superstition, and began the slow process of excavation. What emerged from the sand told a story that seemed to bridge the gap between scripture and history, between myth and archaeological fact. This was Etemenanki, the temple tower of Babylon, whose name meant foundation of heaven and earth. Ancient texts described it as a ziggurat of 7 levels, each painted a different colour, rising to a height that made observers crane their necks and shade their eyes against the sun. At its summit stood a shrine where priests performed rituals meant to connect the earthly realm with the divine, where the god Marduk was said to descend to meet with his worshippers. Layard found inscriptions, cuneiform tablets that had survived in the dry climate, that spoke of the tower's construction and reconstruction over centuries. King Nebuchadnezzar II, who ruled Babylon in the 6th century before the Common Era, had left detailed records of his restoration work. He described how previous rulers had built the tower but failed to complete it, how the head of the structure had not been finished, how he himself had mobilized the population to rebuild what time and neglect had damaged. The king's words carried pride and piety in equal measure, describing how he had overlaid the tower with baked brick and lapis lazuli, how he had raised its summit to rival the heavens themselves. But Etemenanki was not the only discovery. As excavations expanded across Mesopotamia throughout the 19th century, archaeologists uncovered ziggurat after ziggurat, each one a stepped pyramid rising from the flat plains, each one designed to create a physical connection between human and divine realms. At Leonard Woolley would later uncover a magnificently preserved ziggurat with its staircases still intact. At Uruk, German archaeologists found the remains of temple towers that predated even the great structures of Egypt. The pattern became clear. The ancient Mesopotamians had been obsessed with building high, with creating architectural mountains in a landscape that had none. More significant than the structures themselves were the texts. Thousands of clay tablets emerged from the ruins, baked hard by ancient fires or preserved by fortunate burial conditions, bearing cuneiform script that scholars were just learning to decipher. Among these texts were creation myths, king lists, administrative records, and most intriguingly, flood narratives that bore striking similarities to biblical accounts. The Epic of Gilgamesh, discovered at Nineveh, told of a great flood that destroyed humanity, with only one man and his family surviving by building an ark. The Eridu Genesis described how the gods had once spoken a single language with humanity, before confusion entered the world. The discovery that electrified both scholars and the public was this. The ancient Mesopotamians themselves had stories about a time when all people spoke one language, about ambitious building projects that displeased the gods, about the scattering of humanity across the earth. These weren't just biblical stories. They were part of a broader Near Eastern tradition, older than the Hebrew scriptures, woven into the cultural memory of multiple civilizations. The Tower of Babel, it seemed, might not be pure myth after all. It might be the distant echo of something that actually happened, refracted through centuries of retelling, transformed by cultural transmission, but rooted in historical reality. Layard and those who followed him had unearthed more than ruins. They had discovered a bridge between faith and archaeology, between sacred text and secular history. The tower that had existed only in Genesis suddenly had a physical form, or at least a plausible candidate. The city of Babel, dismissed by many as religious fiction, was revealed as Babylon, one of the greatest urban centres the ancient world had ever known. The story that had been told and retold for millennia, that had shaped theology and inspired art across countless cultures, now had archaeological context, historical depth, and physical evidence that demanded serious consideration. Standing in those ruins, looking at bricks that might have been laid, by hands that remembered the story firsthand, 19th century archaeologists felt they were touching something profound. They were witnesses to a moment when myth became memory, when story became stone, when the distance between ancient text and ancient earth grew suddenly remarkably small. The tower had been found. Now the real questions could begin. The announcement of Layard's discoveries sent shockwaves through Victorian society. In London, drawing rooms and Oxford common rooms in churches and scientific societies, people debated what these Mesopotamian ruins might mean. For many believers, the news seemed like divine confirmation, physical proof that the Bible was not mere allegory but historical record. If Babylon existed, if ziggurats reached toward heaven, if ancient texts corroborated the Genesis account, then surely the story of Babel was true in every particular. Faith and fact had aligned, and the alignment felt like vindication. The Reverend George Rawlinson, brother to the famed cuneiform scholar Henry Rawlinson, published enthusiastic accounts linking Etemenanki directly to the Tower of Babel. He argued that the dimensions matched, that the location was correct, that the very bricks cried out in testimony to biblical truth. Popular magazines printed illustrations showing the tower in its imagined glory, 7 levels painted in astronomical colours, with processions of robed figures ascending its staircases. The public imagination seized upon these images with fervour, eager to visualize a story that had existed previously only in the mind's eye. But skepticism arose just as quickly. Scholars trained in the new sciences of archaeology and comparative linguistics raised uncomfortable questions. If Etemenanki was the Tower of Babel, why did the cuneiform inscription say nothing about confused languages or divine judgment? Why did Nebuchadnezzar describe the tower as a restoration project rather than an original construction? Why were there dozens of ziggurats across Mesopotamia, not just one? And most troublingly, why did the archaeological evidence suggest these structures were built over many centuries by different cultures speaking different languages, rather than in a single burst of unified effort? The German scholar Friedrich Delitzsch, son of a famous biblical commentator, took a more radical position. He argued that the biblical writers had borrowed their stories from Mesopotamian sources, that the Tower of Babel was a Hebrew retelling of older Babylonian myths, adapted to serve the theological purposes of Israelite monotheism. The story, in his view, was not history but literature, not fact but metaphor designed to explain the diversity of human languages and the scattering of peoples across the earth. His lectures on Babel and Bible created scandal and controversy, pitting faith against scholarship in ways that sometimes turned bitter and personal. The debate revealed deep anxieties about how to read ancient texts, how to weigh evidence, how to reconcile tradition with discovery. Some believers felt that questioning the literal truth of Genesis was tantamount to questioning God himself. If Babel was metaphor, what about Eden? What about the flood? What about creation itself? The ground beneath certainty seemed to shift and crack like the ruins Layard had excavated, revealing chasms of doubt that many found terrifying. Others, both religious and secular, sought middle ground. Perhaps the story preserved genuine historical memory while embellishing it with theological meaning. Perhaps there had been a tower, an ambitious construction project that failed, and the story had grown in the telling, accumulating symbolic weight as it passed from generation to generation. Perhaps the confusion of languages referred not to miraculous intervention, but to the natural process by which unified cultures fragment and diversify over time. Perhaps myth and history were not opposites but different ways of approaching truth, each valid in its own domain. The archaeological community itself was divided. Some researchers, excited by the biblical connections, perhaps allowed enthusiasm to outpace evidence. They saw what they wanted to see in every brick and tablet, fitting discoveries into predetermined conclusions. Others swung too far in the opposite direction, dismissing any possible connection between Etemenanki and Babel as wishful thinking, arguing that the similarities were superficial and the biblical account was pure fiction with no historical basis whatsoever. Yet the discoveries kept coming. More tablets, more inscriptions, more ziggurats. Each new find added complexity rather than clarity, raising as many questions as it answered. The ancient Mesopotamians had clearly valued vertical architecture, had clearly invested enormous resources in building towers that reached toward heaven, had clearly seen these structures as bridges between human and divine realms. Whether any single tower inspired the biblical story remained disputed, but the cultural context, the architectural ambition, the theological implications were all there, preserved in mud, brick and cuneiform, waiting to be interpreted. Public lectures on the subject drew crowds. Newspapers published editorials arguing both sides. Artists created dramatic paintings showing the tower in various stages of construction and destruction, sometimes depicting God himself descending to scatter the builders, sometimes showing only human figures in the vastness of their own ambition. The Tower of Babel had entered public consciousness not just as religious story but as historical puzzle, archaeological enigma, cultural touchstone that somehow mattered deeply to people who would never see the ruins themselves. What emerged from this first wave of wonder and skepticism was recognition that easy answers were not forthcoming. The tower existed and did not exist. The story was true and was not true. History and myth had become so intertwined that separating them might be impossible. And perhaps some began to suggest that impossibility was itself significant. Perhaps the story's power lay precisely in its ambiguity, in the way it could be read as both literal event and eternal metaphor, as both historical memory and theological teaching. The Victorians loved their certainties, their clear categories, their neat divisions between fact and fiction, science and religion, history and story. The Tower of Babel refused such neat divisions. It stood, or its ruins stood, in a liminal space between worlds, challenging every attempt to pin it down, to make it mean just one thing. The first response was wonder and skepticism in equal measure, and both responses, it turned out, were justified. Both responses were necessary. Both responses were true. The Genesis account is remarkably brief. 11 verses in chapter 11 tell the entire story. The people, unified in language and purpose, settle in the plain of Shinar. They decide to build a city with a tower reaching to heaven, to make a name for themselves, to avoid being scattered across the earth. God descends, observes their work, notes that their unity makes them capable of anything they imagine, and confuses their language so they can no longer understand one another. The building stops. The people scatter. The place is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. The simplicity is deceptive. Those 11 verses carry theological weight that has shaped Western thought for millennia. They explain linguistic diversity as divine judgment. They frame human ambition as hubris deserving punishment. They establish a pattern, repeated throughout Scripture, of humanity reaching too high and being humbled for the attempt. The tower becomes a symbol of pride, of rebellion, of the foolishness of trying to achieve godhood through human effort alone. But the archaeological record tells a different story, or rather, many different stories. Ziggurats were not built in defiance of gods, but in honor of them. They were temples, sacred spaces, designed specifically to facilitate divine presence on earth. The Mesopotamians did not see these towers as acts of rebellion, but as acts of worship, as necessary architecture for a cosmos in which gods and humans needed meeting places, neutral ground where sacrifices could be offered and prayers could rise more directly to heaven. The inscriptions are full of piety, not pride. King Ur-Nammu, who built the Great Ziggurat at Ur around 2100 years before the Common Era, described his work as obedience to divine command. The moon god Nanna had ordered the construction, and Ur-Nammu had merely fulfilled his sacred duty. Nebuchadnezzar, restoring Etemenanki centuries later, wrote that Marduk himself desired the tower's completion, that the work was undertaken not to challenge divine authority, but to honor it, to create a worthy dwelling place for the patron deity of Babylon. Moreover, the ziggurats were never abandoned because of confusion or scattering. They were used for centuries, maintained by successive dynasties, rebuilt after wars or natural disasters, integrated into the religious and political life of their cities. When they fell into ruin, it was not because angry gods stopped construction, but because empires collapsed, populations moved, resources shifted, and the civilizations that had built them ceased to exist. Time and weather and human conflict did what divine judgment supposedly could not, reducing these monuments of mud brick back to the earth from which they had risen. The linguistic evidence complicates matters further. Mesopotamia was never a place of single language unity. Even in the earliest periods for which we have written records, multiple languages coexisted. Sumerian and Akkadian were both used in the same cities, often by the same scribes, serving different functions in administration and religion. Later, Aramaic became widespread. Babylon itself, in its imperial height, was a multilingual metropolis where merchants from Egypt conversed with traders from Persia, where slaves spoke the tongues of conquered peoples, where the idea of everyone speaking one language would have seemed not like a paradise lost, but like a practical impossibility. The scattering of peoples also lacks historical support. Population movements in the ancient Near East were complex, driven by climate change, agricultural innovation, military conquest, trade opportunities, and countless other factors. People migrated gradually over centuries, not suddenly in a single generation. The diversity of human cultures across the earth developed over tens of thousands of years, long before Babylon was even conceived, let alone built. The Tower of Babel could not have caused what already existed before the tower itself. Yet the story persists, and its persistence suggests it serves purposes that historical accuracy cannot fulfill. Every culture has origin stories that explain present realities through past events, often events that are more mythological than factual. The Greeks had their Titanomachy, the Norse their Ragnarok, the Hindus their ages of cosmic cycles. The Tower of Babel functions similarly, using narrative to make sense of observable phenomena, the diversity of languages and cultures, by positing a dramatic moment of transformation. What scholars have come to recognize is that the contradiction between legend and reality is not a problem to be solved but a feature to be understood. The story in Genesis was never intended as archaeological report or linguistic treatise. It was theology, using the form of historical narrative to communicate truths about human nature, divine sovereignty, the limits of human power, and the dangers of collective pride. Whether an actual tower inspired it is almost beside the point. The reality is that ancient Mesopotamia was a place of towers, of linguistic diversity, of population movements, of empires that rose and fell. The legend is that once there was unity, and humanity's attempt to preserve that unity through architectural ambition resulted in irreversible fragmentation. Both are true in different registers, both speak to human experience in different ways, both deserve consideration without forcing them into false alignment. The contradiction remains. The ziggurat at Babylon was a temple to Marduk, not a tower of rebellion. Multiple languages always existed, not as punishment but as natural human diversity. The scattering was gradual, not instantaneous. Yet the story captures something essential about the human condition, about what happens when we build without wisdom, when we pursue unity through force, when we mistake technical capability for moral righteousness. The legend may not match reality, but it illuminates reality, casts light on patterns that purely factual accounts might miss. In the end, the tower is both real and imagined, both brick and symbol, both Mesopotamian ziggurat and biblical parable. The contradiction is not failure, but richness, not confusion, but invitation to think deeply about how we know what we know, how we value different kinds of truth, how we hold together fact and meaning, history and faith, the evidence of our eyes and the wisdom of our stories. By the early 20th century, the academic debate over Babel had crystallized into several distinct camps, each with its own methodology, its own evidence, its own assumptions about how to read ancient texts and interpret ancient ruins. The question was no longer simply whether the tower existed, but what the story meant, where it came from, and why it mattered. The conservative biblical scholars maintained that the Genesis account was historically accurate in its essentials, even if some details might be symbolic or simplified. They pointed to the real existence of Babylon, to the undeniable presence of ziggurats, to ancient traditions across multiple cultures that spoke of linguistic confusion and divine judgment. For them, archaeology had vindicated scripture, providing physical confirmation of what faith had always known. The tower was Etemenanki, or something very much like it, and the story, while perhaps not scientifically precise in modern terms, was fundamentally true. The documentary hypothesis scholars, following the groundbreaking work of Julius Wellhausen, approached the text differently. They argued that Genesis was composed from multiple sources, woven together by later editors, reflecting different periods and different theological perspectives. The Babel story, in their analysis, belonged to the Yahwist source, one of the oldest strata of biblical literature, dating perhaps to the 10th or 9th century before the Common Era. It served a specific purpose within that source, explaining linguistic diversity, while also providing a counterpoint to the patriarchal narratives that followed, contrasting humanity's failed self-aggrandizement with Abraham's obedient wandering. The mythological comparativists took yet another approach. They collected stories from cultures around the world, noting remarkable similarities in themes and motifs. Tower building, divine displeasure, linguistic confusion, these elements appeared in varied forms across disparate civilizations. The Popol view of the Maya spoke of first people who could see too far and were given clouded vision by the gods. Greek mythology told of the Titans stacking mountains to reach Olympus. Hindu texts described cosmic pillars connecting earth and heaven. Perhaps, these scholars suggested, the Babel story was not unique to ancient Israel, but part of a universal human pattern, a recurring narrative that addressed shared anxieties about ambition, unity, and divine boundaries. The Mesopotamian specialists offered more grounded theories. Some proposed that the story originated during the Babylonian exile, when Israelite captives would have seen Etemenanki firsthand, would have witnessed the multilingual chaos of imperial Babylon, and would have created a story that explained and critiqued what they observed. The tower represented Babylonian power and pretension. The linguistic confusion reflected the empire's diversity. The divine judgment was wishful thinking, a hope that the mighty would be humbled. The story was not ancient memory, but contemporary political commentary, dressed in the garb of primordial history. Others suggested earlier origins. Perhaps the story came from Mesopotamian sources themselves, transmitted northward through trade routes and cultural exchange, adapted by Israelite storytellers to fit their own monotheistic framework. The Eridu Genesis, discovered in fragmentary tablets, contained elements that seemed parallel to biblical narratives. The Epic of Gilgamesh had already proven that flood stories crossed cultural boundaries. Why not tower stories as well? Perhaps Babel was Hebrew adaptation of Babylonian myth, just as some argued that much of Genesis drew on older Near Eastern traditions. The linguistic anthropologists entered the debate from yet another angle. They noted that the diversity of human languages was a puzzle that ancient peoples, lacking modern, evolutionary linguistics, would naturally try to explain through story. Every culture needed an origin myth for its language, for the languages of its neighbours, for the fact that different peoples spoke differently. The Tower of Babel served that explanatory function for ancient Israel, providing a theological rationale for observable reality. Whether a tower actually existed was less important than the story's ability to make sense of the world as experienced. More radical scholars argued that the entire debate was misguided. Trying to locate a historical kernel in mythological narrative was like trying to find the real location of Eden or the actual mountain where Moses received the commandments, these stories functioned, symbolically, not historically. They were literature, not journalism. They conveyed truth through metaphor, through archetype, through the logic of narrative rather than the logic of chronology. The tower was nowhere and everywhere, a symbol of every human attempt to achieve security through collective power, to reach heaven through earthly means, to build monuments that would make names immortal. The psychological interpreters, influenced by the emerging field of psychoanalysis, saw the tower as representing something deeper still. It was the ego's attempt to transcend limitation, the human desire to be more than human, to overcome finitude through grand projects and unified purpose. The confusion of languages was psychological fragmentation, the way collective identity breaks down when pride replaces humility, when building replaces being, when external achievement substitutes for internal development. The tower was not in Mesopotamia, but in the human psyche, built and destroyed in every generation that forgot the lessons of its predecessors. What became clear as the 20th century progressed was that no single theory could contain the complexity of Babel. The story was too rich, too layered, too embedded in multiple contexts to yield to simplistic explanation. It was historical memory and theological parable, Mesopotamian borrowing and Israelite innovation, political critique and psychological insight, specific event and universal symbol. The debate continued not because scholars were obtuse, but because the subject matter resisted reduction, demanded multiple perspectives, revealed different facets depending on the angle of approach. The theories multiplied, overlapped, contradicted, and sometimes synthesized. Each added something valuable to understanding, even when each claimed too much for its own methodology. The tower stood at the center of these debates, silent in its ruins, speaking in its texts, meaning different things to different interpreters, refusing to be finally explained, remaining perpetually open to new questions, new evidence, new ways of thinking about what happened in Shinar when humanity decided to build something that would reach the sky. The serious archaeological investigation of Babylon began in earnest in 1899, when a German expedition led by Robert Koldewey arrived with funding from the Kaiser himself and a mandate to excavate systematically, scientifically, completely. Previous explorers had dug quickly, looking for spectacular finds and museum-worthy artifacts. Koldewey intended something different. He would uncover the entire city, map its streets, trace its walls, reconstruct its daily life. And at the heart of his investigation stood Etemenanki, the tower that might or might not be Babel. The work was painstaking. Koldewey's team established a grid system, photographed everything before removal, kept detailed records of every fragment discovered. They employed hundreds of local workers, trained them in proper excavation technique, created a small village near the ruins to house the operation. Year after year they dug, removing centuries of accumulated sand and debris, revealing the outline of ancient Babylon layer by layer, period by period, dynasty by dynasty. What emerged was a city of almost unimaginable scale. The walls, built by Nebuchadnezzar, stretched for miles, wide enough that chariots could race along their tops. The Ishtar Gate, decorated with glazed brick reliefs of bulls and dragons, still showed traces of its original brilliant blue. The processional way, paved with limestone and lined with lion sculptures, led from the gate toward the city centre. Palaces, temples, administrative buildings, residential quarters, the archaeology revealed a metropolis that had once been the largest city on Earth, home to perhaps 200,000 people at its peak. And in the southern quarter of the inner city, Koldewey found what he was looking for. A massive foundation, square in plan, its sides aligned precisely with the cardinal directions, constructed from baked brick and bitumen, exactly as ancient texts described. This was Etemenanki, or what remained of it. The tower itself was gone, cannibalized for building materials by later inhabitants, eroded by rain and wind, reduced to nothing more than its lowest level. But the base was there, measuring just over 300 feet on each side, the dimensions matching almost exactly with those given in ancient cuneiform tablets. Koldewey found those tablets too, buried in the ruins of nearby buildings. One tablet, dating to the reign of Nabopolassar, Nebuchadnezzar's father, described the tower in detail. 7 levels, each smaller than the one below, creating the characteristic stepped pyramid form. The first level painted black, the second white, the third red, the fourth blue, the fifth orange, the sixth silver, the seventh gold. At the summit, a temple faced in blue glazed brick, where the god Marduk was believed to reside during certain festivals. The tablet even gave measurements, allowing modern architects to create reconstruction drawings showing how the tower must have looked in its completed glory. But Coldaway discovered something else, something that complicated the narrative of sudden construction and divine interruption. The foundation showed evidence of multiple building phases. An earlier tower had stood on this spot, built centuries before Nebuchadnezzar, possibly dating back to the time of Hammurabi or even earlier. That tower had been damaged, perhaps by war or earthquake, and partially rebuilt several times. Nebuchadnezzar had essentially started fresh, clearing away the ruins of previous attempts and constructing a new tower on the old foundations. The building was not sudden but gradual, not unified but intermittent, not a single generation's ambition but many generations' accumulated effort. Other excavations across Mesopotamia revealed similar patterns. The ziggurat at Ur had been built, damaged, rebuilt, expanded, modified over nearly 1,000 years. The temple tower at Uruk showed even longer construction history. These were not projects completed in years or even decades, but in centuries, each generation adding to what the previous generation had begun, each dynasty asserting its piety by restoring and enlarging the sacred architecture it had inherited. The linguistic evidence proved equally complex. Excavated tablets showed scribes writing in multiple languages within the same archive, sometimes within the same text. Sumerian remained the language of religious ritual long after it had died as a spoken tongue, preserved by priests the way Latin would later be preserved in medieval Europe. Akkadian evolved into distinct dialects, Babylonian and Assyrian, mutually intelligible but noticeably different. Aramaic spread as a lingua franca of trade and diplomacy. The multilingualism was not confusion but sophistication, not punishment but practical adaptation to the realities of empire and commerce. Yet the investigation also revealed undeniable connections between the physical reality of Babylon and the biblical narrative. The location matched, the construction materials matched, the architectural ambition matched, the cultural context of tower building as religious expression matched. More intriguingly, the excavations uncovered evidence of massive labour mobilization, of workers brought from across the empire to construct Nebuchadnezzar's projects, of people speaking different languages thrown together in service of a single grand vision. Perhaps the story remembered this, remembered the chaos and difficulty of coordinating such diverse populations, and transformed historical memory into theological parable. Coldaway worked at Babylon for 18 years, until the outbreak of the First World War forced him to abandon the site. By then, he had pieced together a picture of the tower that was both more and less than the biblical account suggested. More because the reality was grander, longer-lasting, more culturally significant than 11 verses could convey. Less because the divine drama, the sudden confusion, the scattering of peoples had no archaeological signature, left no trace in the material record beyond the fact that eventually all empires fall, all great projects end, all towers return to dust. The investigation continued after Coldaway. Iraqi archaeologists worked the site. Saddam Hussein, in a bizarre echo of Nebuchadnezzar's ambitions, began reconstruction of parts of ancient Babylon, stamping his own name on bricks in a parody of ancient practice. War came again, and the site suffered damage from military activity and looting. But the core evidence remained, catalogued in German museums and academic publications, telling a story of human ambition and architectural achievement that was remarkable enough without needing divine intervention to make it meaningful. The physical evidence sits in museums now, in Berlin and Baghdad, in London and Paris. Fragments of a lost world carefully preserved in climate-controlled cases, labelled and catalogued, available to scholars and curious visitors who want to touch, however distantly, the reality of ancient Mesopotamia. These are not myths or legends, but objects, things that can be measured and weighed, analysed and dated, things that existed in the world and exist still, bearing witness to what was built and what has fallen. The bricks themselves tell stories. Each one was made by hand, shaped in wooden moulds, dried in the sun or baked in kilns until hard as stone. Many bear inscriptions, cuneiform characters pressed into the wet clay before drying, recording the name of the king who commissioned the work, the god to whom the building was dedicated, sometimes even the year of construction. Nebuchadnezzar's bricks are particularly verbose, repeating the same formula thousands of times. I am Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, provider for Esagila and Azida, exalted firstborn son of Nabopolassar, king of Babylon. The bitumen that held the bricks together has been chemically analysed, sourced to natural seeps that still exist in modern Iraq, still producing the same black sticky substance that ancient builders used. Mixed with sand and reed fibres, it created mortar stronger than many modern compounds, surviving 4,000 years of weathering with remarkable integrity. The ziggurat foundations that remain standing today owe their survival largely to bitumen, to the genius of ancient engineers who understood material science in ways that would not be matched for millennia. The glazed bricks of the Ishtar Gate provide even more direct connection to Babylon's glory. The blue was created from crushed lapis lazuli, imported at enormous expense from Afghanistan, mixed with glass-forming compounds and fired at precise temperatures to create the vibrant colour that still astounds viewers in Berlin's Pergamon Museum. The reliefs of bulls and dragons were moulded in individual bricks, then assembled like a three-dimensional puzzle, each animal requiring dozens of precisely shaped pieces. The technical sophistication rivals anything produced in the ancient world, demonstrating that the Babylonians were not primitive tower builders, but master craftsmen working at the highest levels of their art. The cuneiform tablets provide textual evidence, words preserved in clay that allow ancient voices to speak directly across the centuries. The Asagala tablet, dating to Seleucid period but copying earlier sources, gives exact dimensions for Etemenanki in cubits, allowing conversion to modern measurements. The tower's base was 91 metres square. The height was also 91 metres, creating perfect cubic proportions that reflected Mesopotamian sacred geometry. Each of the 7 levels was a specific height, calculated to create pleasing ratios and astronomical symbolism. Other tablets detail the administrative logistics of tower maintenance, inventories of bricks delivered, records of bitumen shipments, wage payments to workers, requisitions for tools and scaffolding. These mundane documents reveal how such massive projects were actually accomplished, the organisational complexity required to coordinate thousands of workers over years or decades, the economic burden that temple construction placed on the wider society. Building a tower was not magic or miracle but management, requiring careful planning and enormous resources. The astronomical texts are perhaps most revealing of the tower's actual purpose. Babylonian priests were careful observers of celestial phenomena, tracking planets and stars, recording omens and cycles, developing mathematical models that predicted eclipses and planetary positions with impressive accuracy. The ziggurats served as observatories, their height providing unobstructed views of the horizon, their orientation allowing precise measurements of solstices and equinoxes. The connection between earth and heaven was not metaphorical but practical. The towers functioned as instruments for studying the movements of gods who manifested as planets and constellations. Archaeological evidence of the workers themselves comes from residential areas excavated near major temple complexes. These were not slaves but skilled craftsmen, paid in rations of barley and oil, housed in purpose-built quarters, organised into work gangs with foremen and scribes tracking their output. Graffiti scratched into bricks shows their humanity, crude jokes and prayers, names and dates, the same urge to leave a mark, to say I was here, that animates humans in every age. The evidence of destruction is also present. Layers of ash indicating fires, sometimes from war, sometimes from accidents on construction sites where bitumen fires could burn with terrible intensity. Evidence of earthquakes in cracked walls and collapsed sections. Evidence of flooding in silt deposits between building phases. The towers were vulnerable, subject to all the forces that threaten human structures, requiring constant maintenance and periodic reconstruction. They did not fall because God confused languages, but because buildings fall, because time erodes, because civilizations rise and collapse regardless of linguistic unity. Yet there is also evidence of intentional dismantling. Later Persian and Greek rulers, viewing the ziggurats as symbols of conquered peoples rather than sacred architecture worthy of preservation, sometimes systematically dismantled them, using the bricks for other projects, erasing these monuments to demonstrate their own supremacy. Alexander the Great reportedly planned to rebuild Etemenanki but died before beginning the work. His successors had no such ambitions, and the tower continued to deteriorate, becoming the ruin that Calderway would eventually excavate. What the evidence does not show is any single catastrophic moment, any sudden cessation of work, any mass departure of workers speaking confused languages. The archaeological record suggests gradual processes, long-term changes, the normal ebb and flow of construction projects in the ancient world. If there was a Babel moment, a point where everything changed, it left no clear signature in the layers of brick and bitumen. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and the fragments that remain, scattered across museums and scholarly publications, still carry weight and meaning. They prove that the tower was real, that Babylon existed, that the ancient Near East was a place of architectural marvels and sophisticated engineering, that humans did build high, did organize on massive scales, did create monuments meant to link earth and heaven. Whether God intervened to stop them is beyond archaeology's ability to determine, but that they tried, that they built, that they dreamed of touching the sky, that much the evidence confirms beyond doubt. Beneath the surface debate about whether Etemenanki was the biblical tower lies a deeper mystery, one that archaeologists and theologians have been slower to acknowledge, slower to explore. The question is not simply whether the tower existed or whether God confused the languages. The question is why the story was told at all, what purpose it served, what truth it was trying to communicate that could not be stated directly. And the answer to that question reveals something profound about the relationship between power, language, and human community. The biblical text, when read carefully, contains a curious detail that most interpretations overlook. The people build the tower not primarily to reach heaven, but to make a name for themselves, to avoid being scattered across the earth. The tower is not fundamentally about religious rebellion, but about political consolidation, about humanity's first attempt to create permanent unity through centralized power and monumental architecture. It is about the birth of the city-state, of empire, of the complex hierarchical societies that would dominate human civilization for millennia to come. And God's response is equally revealing. He does not destroy the tower directly, does not send fire or flood or earthquake. He simply makes the builders unable to understand one another, and the project collapses not from divine wrath, but from the impossibility of coordination without shared language. The story suggests that linguistic diversity is not punishment but protection, a divine safeguard against the dangers of total unity, against the concentration of all human effort and ambition into a single project, a single vision, a single hierarchy of power. This reading transforms the meaning entirely. Babel is not about human pride, but about human vulnerability, not about punishment, but about preservation, a humanity capable of anything it imagines, unified in language and purpose, might build wonders but might also build horrors, unlimited. Coordination means unlimited potential for both creation and destruction. The confusion of languages fragments power, creates friction, forces negotiation and translation, makes totalitarian unity impossible. It is a gift disguised as curse, a mercy disguised as judgment. The Mesopotamian evidence supports this interpretation in unexpected ways. The great empires of the ancient Near East, Babylon, Assyria, Persia, were all multilingual by necessity. They conquered diverse peoples speaking diverse languages, and had to govern them without imposing complete linguistic uniformity. The result was a kind of creative chaos, a constant negotiation between centre and periphery, between imperial language and local tongues, between the desire for control and the reality of irreducible diversity. The empires that lasted longest were those that accommodated this diversity, rather than trying to eliminate it. Moreover, the ziggurats themselves reveal a contradiction at the heart of Mesopotamian civilization. These towers were meant to connect earth and heaven, to create access points where gods could descend and humans could ascend. But access was carefully controlled. Only priests could climb to the summit, only on specific ritual occasions, only after elaborate purification. The tower that promised universal connection actually enforced hierarchical separation, divided humanity into those who could approach the divine and those who could only watch from below. The deeper mystery is that the Tower of Babel story understands this. It recognizes that projects of unity and grandeur always create new forms of division and exclusion, that the monuments humans build to demonstrate their greatness often become instruments of oppression, that the very ambition to make a name for ourselves requires that some names matter more than others. The confusion of languages prevents the completion not of a temple, but of a system, not of architecture, but of absolute centralized power. Modern scholarship has uncovered evidence that makes this reading even more compelling. Cuneiform tablets record protests by workers, complaints about rations, strikes and work stoppages when conditions became intolerable. The great building projects of Mesopotamia required massive mobilization of labor, often coerced, always hierarchically organized, creating resentment and resistance alongside whatever genuine piety motivated participation. The towers were built on the backs of people who had little choice, whose own dreams were subordinated to the dreams of kings and priests. There is also evidence of linguistic imperialism, of dominant languages being imposed on conquered peoples, of scribes learning multiple languages not from curiosity but from necessity, because administration required communication across linguistic boundaries. The multilingualism of empire was not natural diversity but forced adaptation, and it carried within it the seeds of empire's eventual fragmentation. When central power weakened, linguistic differences that had been suppressed re-emerged, and unity collapsed into the chaos of succession states speaking their own languages, worshipping their own gods, building their own towers or letting the old ones crumble. The biblical story, composed after the Babylonian exile when Israelites had experienced imperial power firsthand, captures this dynamic with remarkable insight. The tower represents not just architectural ambition, but imperial ambition, the desire to organize all humanity under a single banner, speaking a single language, serving a single purpose defined by those in power. And the divine response, confusing languages and scattering peoples, represents the inevitable failure of such projects, the way human diversity resists total coordination, the way difference persists despite every attempt to eliminate it. What they never told us, what the simple Sunday school version of Babel obscures, is that the story is not about sin and punishment, but about the limits of power, not about divine caprice, but about structural resistance to totalitarianism, not about past event, but about recurring pattern. Every generation builds its own towers, every empire attempts its own unification, every concentration of power dreams of permanent stability. And every time linguistic and cultural diversity, the stubborn fact of human difference, prevents absolute unity, creates friction and negotiation, forces accommodation of otherness. The deeper mystery is that this might be good, might be necessary, might be the only thing standing between humanity and its own worst impulses. A world where everyone speaks one language, shares one vision, builds one tower might seem attractive in the abstract, but in practice it means conformity enforced, dissent suppressed, alternatives eliminated. It means the end of creativity that comes from cross-cultural exchange, the end of resilience that comes from having multiple centres rather than a single point of failure, the end of freedom that requires the ability to exit one system and enter another. The tower stands in ruins now, as a monument to a truth that takes time to understand. Unity is not always desirable. Diversity is not always punishment. The confusion of languages, the scattering of peoples, the impossibility of total coordination. These are not problems to be solved, but conditions to be accepted, even celebrated, as the price and privilege of being human in a world too complex for any single story, any single language, any single tower to contain. The turning point came not in a single moment, but in a cascade of moments stretching across the 6th century before the Common Era, when the world that had built the tower began to collapse and transform in ways that would reshape human civilization permanently. Babylon stood at the center of this transformation, both cause and casualty, both agent of change and victim of forces it could not control. What happened in those decades, between 600 and 500 years before the Common Era, determined not just the fate of a city or an empire, but the future possibilities of human organization itself. Nebuchadnezzar died in 562. His death marked the beginning of Babylon's decline, though the city would remain magnificent for decades, though its walls would stand and its temples would function, and Etemenanki would still rise above the plain, still draw pilgrims and priests, still serve as the architectural heart of the greatest city the ancient Near East had ever known. But the coherence was fracturing. The unity that had built the tower was dissolving into succession crises, political intrigue, assassination, and counter-assassination, the familiar chaos that follows when strong leadership gives way to weak. The empire that Nebuchadnezzar had forged through military conquest and massive building projects required continuous maintenance, continuous assertion of central authority, continuous demonstration that Babylon remained strong, remained wealthy, remained favoured by the gods. Without that continuous assertion, the periphery began to drift, to assert independence, to remember that they had been conquered peoples before they became imperial subjects, that they spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, dreamed different dreams than those imposed by Babylonian hegemony. Persia was rising in the east. Cyrus, a relatively minor king of a relatively minor kingdom called Anshan, began expanding his influence through military brilliance and political savvy. He conquered Media, absorbed Lydia, turned his attention toward Babylon. The old empire, weakened by internal division, proved unable to mount effective resistance. In 539, Persian forces entered Babylon without a battle, welcomed by significant portions of the population who saw Cyrus as liberator rather than conqueror, who hoped that new management might bring relief from the chaos of recent decades. Cyrus presented himself as the restorer of proper order, the defender of traditional religion, the corrector of his predecessors' mistakes. His propaganda, preserved in the famous Cyrus Cylinder, claimed that Marduk himself had chosen him to rule Babylon, that the god was displeased with recent kings and had called a foreigner to set things right. Whether anyone believed this or whether it was merely useful fiction is impossible to determine. What matters is that it worked. Babylon submitted without destruction, and Cyrus became emperor of the largest realm the world had yet seen, stretching from the Mediterranean to the borders of India. But Cyrus's empire was different from Nebuchadnezzar's. Where Babylon had insisted on cultural uniformity, on the supremacy of Marduk and the Babylonian language, on centralized control that flowed from the capital to the provinces, Persia experimented with a new model. Cyrus allowed conquered peoples to retain their own languages, their own religions, their own local governance structures. He presented himself not as an imperial overlord but as a king of kings, each subject people maintaining its own identity, while acknowledging Persian supremacy in military and administrative matters. This was revolutionary. It suggested that empire did not require total uniformity, that coordination could be achieved without eliminating diversity, that different peoples speaking different languages could be organized into a functional political system without everyone having to become Babylonian or Persian or anything else. It was, in a sense, the positive version of the Babel story. The recognition that linguistic and cultural diversity could be accommodated rather than suppressed, that unity did not require sameness. The Jewish exiles benefited directly from this shift. Cyrus issued decrees allowing them to return to Judah, to rebuild their temple, to reconstitute their community. Many returned, though many also stayed in Babylon, having built lives and businesses during the exile, having learned to navigate multilingual cosmopolitan existence. Those who returned carried with them the stories they had refined during captivity, including the story of the tower, now polished into its final form, now loaded with all the meaning that exile had given it. The turning point was not Cyrus's conquest alone, but what that conquest revealed. The age of the great centralized territorial empires that spoke one language and worshipped one god was ending. The future belonged to more flexible, more diverse, more decentralized forms of organization. Babylon had built its tower to prevent scattering, to maintain unity through architectural grandeur and cultural conformity. But the tower had not prevented scattering. Nothing could prevent scattering. The human future was multilingual, multicultural, multipolar, and no amount of bricks and bitumen could change that. Etemenanki itself became a symbol of this transition. Cyrus left it standing but did not invest heavily in its maintenance. His successors were even less interested. By the time Alexander the Great arrived 2 centuries later, the tower was already deteriorating, its upper levels crumbling, its religious functions diminishing, as the old Babylonian priesthood lost influence and resources. Alexander planned reconstruction, saw the tower as a wonder worth preserving, but his death ended those plans. The tower continued to decay, mined for building materials, eroded by weather, slowly returning to the plane from which it had risen. The turning point was architectural and political, but also conceptual. the world that had believed in the possibility and desirability of total unity, of everyone speaking one language and building one tower and making one name for themselves, was giving way to a world that recognized diversity as inevitable, and perhaps even valuable, that saw linguistic and cultural difference not as problems to be solved but as realities to be accommodated. The confusion of languages was not divine punishment but natural condition, and the task was not to reverse it but to learn to live with it, to build systems that worked across difference rather than trying to eliminate difference. When everything changed, it changed in the direction of plurality, of multiplicity, of the permanent fragmentation of what the tower builders had tried to unify. Whether this was tragedy or triumph, curse or blessing, remained a matter of interpretation. But that it happened, that the turning point marked the end of one kind of human ambition and the beginning of another, that much was clear. The tower stood as memorial to the dream of unity, and its ruins testified to the impossibility of that dream, to the necessity of finding other ways, other visions, other architectures for human community that did not require everyone to speak the same language or serve the same tower or bow before the same throne. The fall of Babylon as the world's dominant power did not happen overnight, did not occur in a single catastrophic moment that contemporaries recognized as historical watershed. Cities rarely die dramatically. They fade, slowly losing population and prestige, slowly declining from metropolis to provincial town to collection of ruins inhabited by squatters and scavengers. Babylon's fall followed this familiar pattern, taking centuries to complete, leaving time for observers to document the process, to reflect on what was being lost, to wonder whether decline was inevitable or whether different choices might have preserved what was slipping away. By the time Herodotus visited around 450 before the Common Era, Babylon was still impressive but clearly diminished. The Greek historian described walls so wide that chariots could turn on top of them, gates covered in bronze, streets laid out in perfect grid, temples glittering with gold. But he also noted empty quarters, abandoned buildings, a population that no longer filled the vast space enclosed by Nebuchadnezzar's fortifications. The city that had once housed 200,000 people now held perhaps half that number, and many of those were Persian administrators and garrisoned soldiers rather than native Babylonians. The economic consequences were profound. Babylon had been the centre of a vast trade network, the hub where goods from India and the Persian Gulf met products from the Mediterranean and Anatolia, where merchants negotiated in multiple languages, where banking and credit systems more sophisticated than anything Europe would develop for another millennium facilitated commerce across impossible distances. As Persian power shifted the imperial capital to Persepolis and Susa, as trade routes adjusted to new political realities, Babylon lost its centrality, became one node among many, rather than the node around which everything else oriented. The temples suffered particularly. Es-Agila, the great temple of Marduk that had stood beside Etemenanki, had been maintained by resources flowing in from across the empire, by donations from kings who understood that religious legitimacy required honouring Babylon's gods. As those resources diminished, as royal attention focused elsewhere, the temples struggled to maintain their properties, to pay their priests, to continue the elaborate daily rituals that had defined Mesopotamian religion for millennia. The gods were not dying, but their houses were falling into disrepair, and that was almost the same thing. Yet the fall was also a kind of rise, a transformation that opened new possibilities even as it closed old ones. The weakening of centralized imperial power meant that local cultures could reassert themselves, could speak their own languages more openly, could worship their own gods without as much pressure to adopt Babylonian practices. The Jewish community, both those who returned to Judah and those who remained in Mesopotamia, flourished during this period, developing their traditions, refining their texts, establishing patterns of diaspora existence that would sustain them through subsequent centuries of statelessness. The intellectual consequences were equally significant. Babylonian astronomical knowledge, refined over centuries of careful observation from temple towers, spread throughout the Hellenistic world. Greek scholars learned from Babylonian priests, adopted their mathematical techniques, integrated their star catalogues into emerging Greek science. The wisdom of Babylon did not die with Babylon's political power. It dispersed, fertilized other traditions, contributed to the explosion of learning that characterized the Hellenistic period and later the Islamic Golden Age. Writing itself, the cuneiform script that had recorded Mesopotamian civilization for 3,000 years, began its long decline. Aramaic, written in a simpler alphabetic script, was easier to learn and more adaptable to different languages. As Aramaic spread as the common language of administration and commerce, cuneiform became increasingly restricted to traditional religious contexts, maintained by priestly families who guarded their specialized knowledge. Eventually even they would abandon it, and the ability to read the ancient tablets would be lost for 2 millennia until 19th century scholars rediscovered the key. The consequence for Etemenanki was visible and tragic. Without royal patronage, without the resources of a functioning temple economy, maintenance ceased. The tower that had required constant repair, constant renewal of its bricks and bitumen, began to deteriorate rapidly. Upper levels collapsed, their bricks salvaged by local residents for new construction. The glazed tiles that had made the summit shine like gold in the sunlight were pried loose and sold. Rain eroded the mud brick core. Wind carved channels through weakened walls. Within a few generations, the tower that had taken centuries to build was reduced to a stump, then to a foundation, then to a depression in the earth marked by scattered bricks and fading memories. Alexander the Great's brief moment of attention could not reverse the decline. His vision of restoring Etemenanki as a symbol of his synthesis between Greek and Eastern cultures died with him, and his successors had neither the resources nor the inclination to attempt such monumentally expensive reconstruction. The tower remained a ruin, visited occasionally by travellers who wanted to see where the great structure had stood, but no longer functioning as religious or civic centre, no longer defining the identity of the city around it. By the 1st century of the Common Era, when the Roman author Strabo compiled his geography, Babylon was virtually abandoned. He described it as a desert, its walls breached, its temples empty, its palaces inhabited by nothing but ghosts and memories. The city that had ruled the world, that had built the greatest tower human hands had ever raised, had returned to the dust from which its bricks had been moulded. The consequence of its fall was erasure so complete that later generations would debate whether it had even existed, whether the biblical Babylon was real city or symbolic representation, historical place or apocalyptic metaphor. Yet the ideas Babylon had incubated survived. The concept of universal empire, of a single political system governing diverse peoples, would be taken up by Rome and later by Islamic caliphates and European colonial powers. The dream of a common language facilitating global coordination would resurface repeatedly, from Latin to French to English, from Esperanto to computer code. The ambition to build monuments that would make names immortal would drive architecture in every age, from medieval cathedrals to modern skyscrapers, each generation convinced that their towers would be different, would last, would not fall into the same ruins that claimed all previous attempts at permanence. The consequence was not just the fall of one city or one tower. It was the demonstration, written in brick and bitumen, that nothing human is permanent, that the greatest powers decline, that the most ambitious projects eventually fail, that unity is temporary and diversity is enduring, that what goes up must come down, that height achieved through human effort alone cannot be maintained indefinitely. The tower fell. The lesson remained, carved not in durable stone but in the more enduring medium of story, of memory, of meaning that survives the collapse of the structures that first inspired it. The Tower of Babel, whether as historical event or mythological narrative, has shaped human consciousness in ways that few other stories can match. It has influenced theology and politics, art and architecture, linguistics and anthropology, becoming a foundational reference point for how we think about language, community, diversity, and the proper limits of human ambition. Its impact extends far beyond the ancient Near East, far beyond Judaism and Christianity, far beyond the academy and into everyday language, everyday assumptions about how the world works and why it works that way. In theological terms, Babel established a pattern that would echo through Judeo-Christian thought for millennia. It became the prototype of human pride meeting divine judgment, of technical capability untempered by moral wisdom, of collective action pursued without proper deference to transcendent authority. The tower represented what happens when humanity forgets its place, attempts to grasp what should remain beyond grasp, builds without consulting the one who made building possible. This interpretation justified hierarchical social structures, religious authority over secular power, the necessity of humility before God and Church. But the impact went beyond simple moralizing. Babel became crucial to Christian eschatology, to visions of how history would end. The New Testament book of Acts describes Pentecost, when the Holy Spirit descends and allows the apostles to speak in multiple languages, each listener understanding in their own tongue. This was explicitly presented as Babel reversed, as the healing of the linguistic fragmentation that had scattered humanity. The coming kingdom of God would reunite what the tower had divided, would restore unity without the pride that had made divine intervention necessary. Christian theology thus embedded Babel into its understanding of salvation history, making linguistic diversity both sign of fallen creation and something to be overcome in the final redemption. Islamic tradition absorbed the story as well, though with different emphasis. The Quran does not mention the tower explicitly, but Islamic commentators developed elaborate narratives about Nimrod and his tower, about the prophet Abraham's opposition to idolatry, about divine judgment on those who claimed equality with God. In Islamic thought, Babel became associated with Nimrod's tyranny, with the oppression of believers, with the conflict between authentic monotheism and the polytheistic systems of Mesopotamia. The tower represented not just pride but idolatry, not just ambition but blasphemy. The political impact has been equally profound. For centuries, the Tower of Babel served as warning against universal monarchy, against the concentration of too much power in too few hands, against attempts to organize all humanity under a single system. Political theorists from Augustine to Montesquieu invoked Babel to argue for limits on sovereignty, for the value of multiple kingdoms and republics rather than single world empire, for the necessity of checks and balances that prevent any one authority from achieving total dominance. The linguistic diversity that resulted from Babel was thus reinterpreted as political blessing, as the structural guarantee of human freedom through fragmentation of power. In the age of European colonialism, Babel took on new and troubling meanings. Colonial powers used the story to justify linguistic imperialism, arguing that spreading European languages was a kind of restoration, a reversal of fragmentation, a gift of unified communication to peoples who had been isolated by linguistic diversity. The British Empire saw English, the French Empire saw French, the Spanish Empire saw Spanish as the new universal language, and they enforced this vision with violence and cultural suppression. Babel authorized the destruction of indigenous languages, the imposition of foreign tongues, the attempt to recreate linguistic unity, even as it warned against the pride such attempts embodied. The scientific study of language bears Babel's imprint as well. Early linguists assumed that all languages must have descended from a single original tongue, sought to reconstruct that proto-language, to trace the paths of differentiation from unity to diversity. The comparative method in linguistics, which reveals historical relationships between languages, was partly motivated by the desire to map the scattering, to understand how Latin became Italian and French and Spanish, how Proto-Indo-European became Sanskrit and Greek and English. Even as linguistics became more sophisticated, more skeptical of biblical timelines, the basic question remained: how did one become many, and could the process be reversed? In art and architecture, Babel has been endlessly depicted, endlessly reimagined. Peter Bruegel's famous painting shows a massive spiral structure modelled on the Colosseum, showing the tower as both magnificent achievement and obvious folly. The upper levels clearly impossible to complete, the whole project obviously doomed. Countless other artists have tried to visualize the tower, each generation projecting its own architectural fantasies and fears onto the biblical description. Modern skyscrapers, from the Empire State Building to the Burj Khalifa, are routinely compared to Babel. The comparison sometimes celebratory, but always carrying an undertone of warning, a reminder that height can be dangerous, that what rises can fall. The impact on how we think about translation and multilingualism continues into the present. The European Union, trying to coordinate dozens of member states speaking dozens of languages, is sometimes called modern Babel, and the comparison contains both celebration of diversity and anxiety about whether coordination is possible without imposing a single dominant language. The Internet, creating global communication without global linguistic unity, raises similar questions. Machine translation promises to overcome Babel technologically, to create automatic understanding across linguistic boundaries, to achieve through algorithms what empire and education could not achieve through force. Yet the story also authorises resistance to linguistic imperialism. If God desired diversity, if the confusion of languages was intentional rather than accidental, then attempts to impose linguistic unity are not just impractical but impious, not just difficult but wrong. Indigenous language preservation movements invoke Babel implicitly, arguing that linguistic diversity is valuable, that each language represents unique ways of thinking and being in the world, that loss of languages is loss of human heritage comparable to extinction of species. The Tower that sought to prevent scattering now authorises celebration of the scattering's results. The impact in the end is paradoxical. The same story that warned against human pride has been used to justify human conquest. The same narrative that explained linguistic diversity has been invoked to suppress it. The same text that fragmented humanity has been read as prophecy of eventual reunification. Babel means what each generation needs it to mean, serves the purposes of power and resistance simultaneously, functions as conservative warning and progressive inspiration. The Tower fell, but its shadow stretches across all subsequent human attempts to build high, to speak universally, to organise globally, reminding us that such attempts have history, have precedent, have ended before in ruins and confusion, and likely will again. In all the debates about archaeology and theology, about what the Tower meant and whether it existed, about divine judgment and linguistic imperialism, the actual people who might have built such a structure mostly disappear. They become abstract labour, unnamed masses, extras in a drama written by kings and gods. But they were real as the bricks they supposedly shaped, as real as the bitumen they hauled up endless staircases, as real as their exhaustion at day's end and their dreams in the darkness before dawn. Consider the brickmaker. His name might have been something like Rimsin or Nabishuma Idunum, though we will never know. He woke before sunrise every day of his adult life, walked to the clay pits at the river's edge, dug the black alluvial soil that Mesopotamia produced so abundantly. He mixed it with straw and water, kneaded it with his feet, poured it into wooden moulds that produced bricks of uniform size. He set them in rows to dry in the sun, tens of thousands of bricks over the course of a season, millions over the course of a lifetime. His back ached, his hands cracked and bled. He worked because he had to work, because he had family to feed, because the temple employed him, because his alternative was starvation. Did he care about making a name for humanity? Did he think about touching heaven? Or did he think about his ration of barley, about whether his wife was pregnant again, about his son's apprenticeship, about the neighbour's dispute that required arbitration, about everything except the grand vision that motivated the architects and priests? The Tower was his job, not his dream. He made bricks because brickmaking was what he knew, what his father had taught him, what would feed his children until they were old enough to learn, their own trades. Consider the woman who carried water. She does not appear in any text, leaves no archaeological trace beyond the worn steps of the well where she drew water for the workers. But she was there, making dozens of trips each day with a clay jar balanced on her head, bringing the water that kept the brickmakers working, that mixed the bitumen, that sustained life on the construction site. She saw the Tower rising, must have felt some pride that her labour contributed to something magnificent. But she also felt the weight of the jar, the pain in her shoulders, the fear of slipping on wet steps, the constant pressure to move faster, bring more, never rest. Did she wonder why they were building so high? Did she question whether it was worth the cost in human suffering? Or did she simply do what was required, finding meaning not in the grand project but in the small solidarities of the workers, in shared meals, in gossip and song, in the relationships that made labour bearable? Her language, whatever it was, contained words for exhaustion and hope, for complaint and endurance, for the way bodies feel when pushed to their limits day after day without relief. Consider the child who played in the shadow of the Tower, too young to work but old enough to understand that his world revolved around this growing structure, that his father's moods depended on whether the overseer was satisfied, that his family's security rested on continued employment. He climbed on discarded bricks, built miniature towers in imitation of the adults, imagined himself someday joining the workforce, contributing to the great project. Or perhaps he resented it. Resented the tower for stealing his father's attention, for making his mother always tired, for dominating every conversation, every dream, every aspect of daily existence. Did he live to see it completed, or did he grow old watching it rise slowly, generation after generation, beginning to suspect that completion was impossible, that the tower would consume his children's lives and his children's children's lives and never be finished? Did he pass on the dream or the resentment? Did he tell his children about the glory of what they were building, or about the waste of human potential, the lives ground down to produce something that no one actually needed? Consider the scribe who recorded the work. He sat in the shade, stylus in hand, clay tablet on his lap, marking off bricks delivered and workers paid. He had learned the cuneiform script through years of training, had memorized king lists and mathematical tables, had mastered the complex syllabary that represented Akkadian phonemes in written form. His skill elevated him above manual labourers, but he was still a functionary, still subject to the whims of those above him, still anxious about his position, about whether he would be retained or replaced, about whether his sons would inherit his status or fall back into the labouring masses. Did he believe in the tower? Did he see it as sacred work or as administrative project, as connection between earth and heaven or as employment programme? Did he write anything personal in the margins of his tablets, any complaint or prayer or joke that would survive the centuries and let us know what he actually thought? Or did he maintain professional detachment, recording only what was required, keeping his doubts and dreams to himself? Consider the priest who supervised. He understood the sacred geometry, the astronomical alignments, the ritual requirements that determined how high each level must rise, what colours should adorn each tier. He believed he was doing God's work, creating architecture that would allow Marduk to descend from heaven, that would facilitate the cosmic order upon which all prosperity depended. His faith was genuine, and so was his power, and so was his blindness to the cost that his vision imposed on others. Did he see the workers as human beings or as instruments? Did he care about their suffering or only about the completion of the project? Did he ever wonder whether God actually wanted this tower, or whether he had convinced himself that his own ambitions were divine commands? Did he feel guilt, watching people labour and die for his vision, or only satisfaction at the structure rising according to plan? These are the forgotten voices, the people whose lives were consumed by the tower, but whose names were never inscribed on its bricks, whose stories were never recorded on cuneiform tablets, whose dreams and fears and hopes dissolved into the anonymity of history. They are why the story matters, why the tower's fall might be blessing as much as curse, because projects of monumental scale always require human sacrifice, always demand that ordinary people subordinate their own lives to the grand visions of kings and priests, always extract more than they give to those who do the actual building. When God confused the languages, when the tower fell incomplete, when the workers scattered, they did not lose something. They regained something. They regained the right to their own dreams, the possibility of building for themselves rather than for the glory of distant gods and near tyrants. They regained their voices, diverse and mutually incomprehensible perhaps, but their own. They regained their lives, and that, more than anything else, is what the story remembers, what the ruins testify to, what the scattered peoples carry with them into all the generations that follow. Not everyone who heard about the tower wanted to build it. Not every community in Shinar embraced the vision of unified humanity reaching toward heaven through monumental architecture. There were always those who questioned, who doubted, who resisted in ways large and small, who understood that projects of such scale and ambition inevitably concentrate power in dangerous ways, inevitably create hierarchies that exploit rather than elevate, inevitably demand sacrifices from those least able to bear them. The resistance left few traces in the official records. Kings and priests controlled the cuneiform tablets, determined what was written and preserved, and they had no interest in recording dissent, in memorializing those who refused to participate, in preserving the voices of those who saw the tower not as glory, but as monument to oppression. But resistance happened nonetheless, can be glimpsed in fragments, inferred from silences, understood from the logic of how power works and how ordinary people respond when power demands too much. Some resistance was passive, the kind that leaves no direct evidence but accomplishes its goals through non-cooperation and delay. Workers who moved slowly, who misunderstood instructions, who who delivered materials to wrong locations or damaged tools through apparent carelessness. These were not accidents but strategies, ways of asserting minimal control over conditions they could not refuse outright, ways of imposing costs on those who extracted their labour without consent. The tower rose slowly, not just because construction was difficult, but because the workers made it difficult, because they understood that the slower the progress, the less total labour would be extracted from their lifetimes. Other resistance was more direct. Cuneiform tablets from various Mesopotamian cities record labour disputes, strikes, demands for better rations or reduced hours. Workers organised, appointed representatives, negotiated collectively for improved conditions. When negotiation failed, they sometimes simply left, abandoned the work sites, returned to their villages despite threats of punishment. The temples and palaces needed their labour more than they could afford to lose them entirely, which gave workers leverage they occasionally used, though always at considerable risk. There is also evidence of sabotage, walls that collapsed because mortar was deliberately weak, bricks that crumbled because clay was poorly prepared, tools that broke because they had been subtly damaged. Whether any of this affected Etemenanki specifically is impossible to know, but the pattern existed across Mesopotamian construction projects. Some workers, unable to refuse participation entirely, found ways to ensure that their labour produced less than it might have, that the grand visions of kings and priests encountered material resistance in the very bricks and bitumen that supposedly embodied unquestioned obedience. Religious resistance was perhaps most significant. Not everyone worshipped Marduk, not everyone accepted that the god of Babylon deserved such monumental tribute. Other cities had their own patron deities, their own ziggurats, their own claims to cosmic significance. Priests in Ur served the moon god Nana, priests in Uruk served the goddess Inanna, and they resented resources and attention flowing to Babylon, resented the implication that Marduk was supreme, that Etemenanki was more important than their own temple towers. This religious competition created political resistance, as local elites opposed Babylonian hegemony by invoking their own divine authorities, their own sacred architectures, their own visions of cosmic order that did not centre on Babylon. The biblical tradition itself preserves a form of resistance. The story of the Tower of Babel is not neutral reportage but critique, a narrative that judges the tower builders harshly, that presents their project as arrogant and deserving of divine punishment. This perspective came from the Israelites, a people who experienced Mesopotamian civilization from a position of subjugation, who were conquered by Babylon, exiled to its cities, forced to witness its grandeur while their own temple lay in ruins. The Babel story is their resistance, their refusal to be awed by Babylonian power, their insistence that height is not righteousness, that architectural achievement does not equal divine approval, that the tower will fall regardless of how magnificent it appears. There were also those who resisted by offering alternative visions. Prophetic voices across the ancient Near East challenged the assumptions underlying monumental architecture, questioned whether gods actually desired expensive temples and elaborate rituals, suggested that justice and mercy mattered more than bricks and bitumen. The prophet Micah, writing in the 8th century before the Common Era, articulated this resistance explicitly. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God? Not towers, not monuments, not architectural demonstrations of power, but the humility and justice that tower building invariably violates. Philosophical resistance emerged as well, thinkers who questioned whether human unity was desirable, whether linguistic diversity was actually curse, or whether it might be gift. These voices are harder to trace because they operated outside official religious structures, existed as oral traditions and marginal texts that mostly fail to survive. But hints remain in wisdom literature, in proverbs and sayings that warn against pride, against building too high, against assuming that human hands can create permanence. The tower's eventual collapse vindicated these skeptics, proved that the resistors had been right all along. Economic resistance took the form of avoiding conscription, of hiding resources, of refusing to pay taxes designated for temple construction. The state had considerable power to compel compliance, but its reach was not absolute, especially in rural areas distant from urban centres. Farmers who underreported their harvests, merchants who concealed their wealth, artisans who claimed their skills were inadequate for the required work, all found ways to withhold what the tower demanded, to preserve something for themselves and their families, rather than surrendering everything to the collective project. Women's resistance was particularly invisible, but less real. In a society where women rarely controlled property or held official positions, their opposition had to be indirect, expressed through influence within families, through religious devotion to female deities who rivaled male gods, through the transmission of stories and values that questioned the priorities of the male elite. When women taught their children that the tower was foolishness, that the builders were arrogant, that divine judgment would eventually come, they were performing resistance, shaping the next generation to question what the current generation took for granted. The resistance failed, in the sense that the tower was built, that Babylon became the greatest city of its age, that Etemenanki rose to dominate the plain. But resistance also succeeded, in the sense that the tower did not achieve its stated purpose, did not create permanent unity, did not make a name that lasted, did not prevent the scattering it was designed to avoid. The resistors may not have stopped construction, but they preserved the diversity that construction tried to eliminate, maintained the linguistic and cultural differences that would eventually fragment what the builders tried to unify. More importantly, the resistors preserved the memory that building the tower was contested, that not everyone agreed, that alternatives existed. The biblical narrative, by recording divine judgment, authorized all subsequent resistance to imperial projects, to monumental ambitions, to attempts to organize humanity under single visions. Every time someone invokes Babel to question a tower, literal or metaphorical, they are continuing the resistance that began in Shinar, that persisted through construction, that outlasted the structure itself. The opposition did not prevent the tower. But the opposition ensured that the tower would not stand forever, that what was built in pride would fall in humility, that the voices of dissent would echo longer than the voices of triumph, that resistance would be remembered when compliance was forgotten. Those who refused to build, who questioned the vision, who maintained alternative possibilities, they are the ones who truly made history, who shaped what came after, who proved that human beings are never simply instruments of grand designs, but agents with their own purposes, their own values, their own power to say no. Centuries after the tower fell into ruins, after Babylon declined from imperial capital to provincial town, to collection of mud brick foundations barely visible above the desert floor, something unexpected happened. The story began to wake up, to take on new life, to inspire not construction, but creativity, not architecture, but art, not political unity, but cultural flowering. The Renaissance in Europe, the Islamic Golden Age, the Jewish Enlightenment, each in its own way found in Babel a source of meaning, a prompt for reflection, a catalyst for the kind of awakening that happens when inherited stories are read with fresh eyes. The Renaissance artists discovered in Babel a subject perfectly suited to their interests in perspective, in architectural grandeur, in the relationship between human ambition and divine order. Peter Bruegel the Elder painted his famous Tower of Babel in 1563, creating an image so powerful that it essentially defined how Western culture would visualize the story for centuries. His tower was based on the Roman Colosseum but expanded to impossible scale, spiraling upward in level after level, each tier showing detailed construction, tiny figures of workers swarming like ants across scaffolding and ramps. The painting was both celebration of human technical achievement and warning against its excesses, showing the tower as magnificent and doomed simultaneously. Bruegel painted it twice, actually, suggesting the subject obsessed him, that he saw in it something essential about his own age. The 16th century was a time of rising nation-states, of religious warfare between Catholics and Protestants, of debates about whether Christian unity could or should be preserved through force. The tower spoke to these anxieties, suggested that unity imposed from above might be neither achievable nor desirable, that fragmentation might be God's will rather than human failure. The painting was not just illustration of ancient story, but commentary on contemporary politics, using Babel to question the imperial ambitions of his own time. Other artists followed, each generation reimagining the tower through its own cultural lens. In the Baroque period, the tower became more theatrical, more dramatic, with swirling clouds and divine judgment rendered in operatic intensity. In the Enlightenment, it became more rational, more architectural, less about God's intervention, and more about the practical problems of coordinating such massive construction. In the Romantic era, it became sublime, a monument to human striving that inspired awe even in failure, that suggested that attempting the impossible was noble, regardless of outcome. Literature experienced its own Babel renaissance. Dante placed the giants who built the tower in the pit of hell, condemned not for their ambition, but for their pride, for believing they could rival God. Milton referenced Babel in Paradise Lost, linking it to Satan's fall, to the original rebellion that preceded human attempts at heaven storming. Later writers, less bound by orthodox theology, found in Babel a symbol of human diversity as positive good, of linguistic richness as cultural wealth rather than divine punishment. Jorge Luis Borges wrote of the Library of Babel, an infinite library containing every possible book, transforming the tower into metaphor for language itself, for the endless generation of meaning through combination and recombination of fundamental elements. The awakening was theological as well as artistic. The Protestant Reformation, fragmenting Christian unity across Europe, forced new engagement with Babel. Was the diversity of Protestant denominations a curse, a failure to maintain the single true church? Or was it a blessing, an escape from the tyranny of unified hierarchy, a recovery of authentic faith through fragmentation of corrupt power? Different factions used Babel to argue opposite positions, but all agreed the story mattered, that it spoke to their situation, that ancient Shinar had something to say about 16th century Europe. Jewish interpreters, meanwhile, developed their own rich tradition of Babel commentary. The Talmudic rabbis debated what language humanity spoke before the confusion, whether it was Hebrew or some more primordial tongue. They discussed whether the punishment was proportionate to the crime, whether God was justified in scattering peoples who had only tried to build, whether the story taught humility or warned against tyranny. Medieval Jewish philosophers like Maimonides read Babel allegorically, seeing in it lessons about the proper relationship between reason and faith, between human knowledge and divine mystery, between earthly city and heavenly Jerusalem. The Islamic world engaged Babel through its own traditions, through stories of Nimrod and Abraham, through Quranic commentary and philosophical treatise. Islamic scholars noted that linguistic diversity was mentioned in the Quran, a sign of God's creative power, that the multiplicity of languages was not punishment, but demonstration of divine artistry. The tower thus became less about judgment, and more about the wisdom of diversity, about God's intention that humanity should exist in multiple forms, speaking multiple tongues, each valid, each revealing different aspects of truth. The scientific awakening brought new dimensions to Babel. Linguists studying the historical development of languages recognized that diversity was natural, that languages evolve through regular processes of sound change and grammatical shift, that the tree of language families represents thousands of years of gradual divergence rather than sudden confusion. This did not necessarily invalidate the story, but relocated its truth from historical event to psychological insight, from explanation of what happened to meditation on what it means, on why humans fear diversity even as we create it, why we dream of unity even as we resist its actual implementation. Anthropologists studying non-Western cultures discovered that Babel was not unique, that many societies had stories explaining linguistic diversity through divine action or primordial event. The Wa people of Myanmar told of how the chief god deliberately created different languages to prevent human rebellion. Australian Aboriginal traditions spoke of a time when all people spoke one tongue before the ancestor being scattered them. The universality suggested that Babel addressed something fundamental, not specific to ancient Israel, but arising from the universal human experience of encountering linguistic difference and needing to make sense of it. The awakening was not recovery of lost truth, but discovery of new meanings, not return to original interpretation, but creation of interpretations appropriate to changed circumstances. Each age found in Babel what it needed to find, used the story to think through its own challenges, its own anxieties about unity and diversity, power and freedom, ambition and humility. The tower that fell in Shinar kept rising in human imagination, kept challenging each generation to decide what it thought about building high, about reaching for heaven, about whether humanity should try to speak with one voice, or celebrate the multitude of voices it actually possesses. The cultural renaissance that Babel inspired was itself a kind of scattering, a diversification of interpretation that mirrored the linguistic diversification the story described. And perhaps that was appropriate. Perhaps that was inevitable. Perhaps that was exactly what the story intended all along, not to provide single authoritative meaning, but to generate endless meanings, not to answer questions, but to keep questions alive, not to resolve, but to inspire the kind of creative engagement that characterizes every genuine Renaissance, every true awakening to possibility. The deepest truth about the Tower of Babel is not whether it existed, or whether God confused the languages, or whether Etemenanki was the actual structure the biblical narrative remembered. The deepest truth is simpler and more profound. Every civilization that builds high eventually falls. Every empire that unifies eventually fragments. Every attempt to organize all humanity under single language and single vision eventually collapses under its own weight, and this pattern repeats so consistently across time and geography that it must reveal something essential about human nature, about the limits of power, about the wisdom embedded in diversity itself. The archaeological record confirms this truth in ways that purely textual analysis cannot. Mesopotamia saw multiple empires rise and fall, each attempting to create lasting unity, each confident that their particular combination of military power and religious authority would prove permanent where predecessors had failed. Sumerian cities were unified under Akkadian rule, which collapsed into fragmentation, which was reunified under Ur, which collapsed again, which gave way to Babylon, which fell to Assyria, which fell to renewed Babylon, which fell to Persia, which fell to Greece, which fell to Parthia, which fell to Rome, which eventually fell to the Islamic caliphates. Each transition involved linguistic and cultural change, each represented a new attempt at unity, each eventually failed to maintain what it had temporarily achieved. The pattern extends far beyond Mesopotamia. Egypt experienced cycles of unity and fragmentation, its powerful dynasties giving way to intermediate periods of division before being reunified by new rulers claiming divine mandate. China saw dynasties rise and fall with such regularity that historians developed theories of cyclical history, of inevitable patterns where centralized power concentrates, becomes corrupt, collapses, and is replaced by new centralization that will repeat the cycle. The Roman Empire, despite its apparent permanence, fragmented into East and West, then into countless successor kingdoms speaking Latin-derived languages that grew increasingly mutually incomprehensible. The linguistic unity Rome imposed dissolved into the diversity of modern Romance languages, a Babel in slow motion, occurring over centuries rather than moments, but following the same pattern of unity giving way to multiplicity. Even more revealing is what happens linguistically within empires. Despite official languages and state-sponsored education, and every incentive to maintain unity, languages diversify. Latin did not remain Latin, but became Italian and French and Spanish and Portuguese and Romanian, each so different that speakers cannot understand each other without translation. Arabic spread across an enormous territory, but diversified into dialects so distinct that Egyptian Arabic and Moroccan Arabic are barely mutually intelligible. English spread globally, but is diversifying rapidly, with Indian English and Nigerian English and Singaporean English developing distinct vocabularies and grammatical features that may eventually produce separate languages. The confusion of languages is not one-time punishment, but ongoing process, happening constantly, resisting every attempt at imposed uniformity. The revelation is that this diversification is not failure but feature, not bug but design principle of how human systems actually work. Centralized unity is fragile, vulnerable to single points of failure, unable to adapt to local conditions, prone to catastrophic collapse when the center cannot hold. Decentralized diversity is resilient, capable of surviving the fall of any particular node, able to evolve solutions appropriate to specific contexts, likely to preserve something even when much is lost. The scattering that Babel describes is not tragedy but survival strategy, not divine punishment, but divine gift disguised as curse. Consider what would have happened if the tower had succeeded, if humanity had remained unified in language and purpose, and had developed high technology within that unity. Every resource, every innovation, every human effort would have been coordinated towards single goals determined by whoever controlled the center. When those goals proved misguided, as they inevitably would, all humanity would have suffered the consequences together. When the center collapsed, as it inevitably would, everything would have collapsed simultaneously. The fall would have been not of one tower, but of all towers, not of one civilization, but of the entire human project. but because languages confused and people scattered, because unity fragmented into diversity, because different groups went different directions and developed different cultures and spoke different tongues. When one civilization fell, others survived. When Rome collapsed, Constantinople endured. When the Abbasid Caliphate weakened, regional dynasties flourished. When the Ming dynasty fell, other Asian civilizations continued. The diversity that seemed like weakness was actually strength. The fragmentation that seemed like failure was actually insurance. The confusion that seemed like curse was actually blessing that took centuries to recognize. The deepest historical truth is that the biblical narrative understood this, encoded this wisdom in mythological form, preserved in story what could not be stated directly given the political context in which the story was composed. The writers who finalized Genesis during or after the Babylonian exile had experienced imperial power firsthand, had seen how empires work, had understood that the unity they created came at enormous cost, that the order they imposed required brutal enforcement, that the grandeur they displayed concealed suffering and oppression. They could not openly attack empire while living under its authority, but they could tell a story, could suggest that what empire called glory God called pride, that what empire called unity God fragmented, that what empire built God scattered. The revelation is also personal, applicable to individual lives as much as civilizations. Every person who tries to build their identity around single language, single culture, single truth, single way of being discovers eventually that diversity within themselves resists such unity. We are multilingual in our souls, speaking different languages to different people in different contexts, presenting different selves that are all genuine but none complete. The attempt to unify all these into single tower, single coherent identity, single name that captures everything we are, inevitably fails. We scatter ourselves across multiple roles and relationships and contexts, and this scattering is not failure but the only way to be fully human. The tower still stands, not in Mesopotamia, but in every attempt to impose unity where diversity is natural, to organize comprehensively what should remain distributed, to reach heaven through earthly means that ignore or suppress the wisdom of fragmentation. And the tower still falls repeatedly, teaching the same lesson to generation after generation that refuses to learn from its predecessors' ruins. The confusion of languages is not something that happened once in Shinar, but something that happens always and everywhere, the universe's way of ensuring that no single system can dominate completely, that alternatives survive, that when towers fall, as they always do, humanity endures in its scattered, diverse, confusing, resilient multiplicity. This is the revelation, the deepest historical truth that Babel preserves. Unity is temporary, diversity is permanent. Attempts to reverse this pattern are doomed, and the sooner we accept this, the sooner we stop building towers and start building networks, stop imposing languages and start learning translation, stop dreaming of names that last forever and start finding meaning in the present moment of scattered, confused, glorious human existence. In the stillness of these reflections, as the ancient story settles into contemporary consciousness, we must ask ourselves what Babel means now, today, in a world that seems simultaneously more unified and more fragmented than anything the tower builders could have imagined. We have technologies that allow instant communication across the planet, translation software that breaks down linguistic barriers, global economic systems that coordinate human activity on scales that dwarf ancient empires. We have, in many ways, rebuilt Babel, not in mud brick, but in fiber optic cables, not in Shinar but everywhere simultaneously, not reaching toward heaven, but connecting horizontally across the entire earth. And yet the confusion persists. We speak the same words but mean different things. We share the same platforms but live in different realities. We coordinate globally but fragment tribally, our apparent unity masking deeper divisions that technology amplifies rather than heals. The tower we have built, this digital, global, interconnected civilization, shows the same vulnerabilities, the same contradictions, the same tension between unity and diversity that the ancient story encoded. What does it mean that we cannot seem to learn this lesson? That every generation rebuilds the tower in new forms, confident that this time will be different, this time the materials are stronger, this time we understand what we are doing? Is this foolishness or necessary ambition? Is the repeated failure tragedy or the point? Are we supposed to stop building towers or to keep building them knowing they will fall, finding meaning in the attempt rather than the completion? The reflection requires honesty about what we actually want. Do we truly desire global unity? Everyone speaking the same language, thinking the same thoughts, organizing around the same values? Or do we desire it in the abstract while recoiling from its implications, from the conformity it would require, from the suppression of difference it would demand? The Babel story suggests that God desired diversity, that the confusion was intentional, that human difference serves purposes we might not fully understand but should learn to trust. If this is true, then our endless attempts at unity might be the problem, not the solution, might be what needs to be abandoned rather than what needs to be achieved. But the story also suggests that complete fragmentation is not the answer either. The scattering was consequence of attempted unity, divine response to human overreach, but not necessarily the ideal state. Perhaps what we need is something between the tower and the scattering, between total unity and total fragmentation, between speaking one language and speaking mutually incomprehensible languages. Perhaps we need translation rather than unity, coordination rather than conformity, networks rather than hierarchies, relationships that cross boundaries rather than boundaries eliminated. The reflection becomes practical in how we think about linguistic diversity today. English has become a global lingua franca, in ways that rival Latin or Arabic at their peaks, enabling communication but also imposing cultural values embedded in the language itself. Should we celebrate this as partial recovery of Babel unity? Or should we resist it as linguistic imperialism, work to preserve minority languages, maintain diversity even at the cost of coordination? The story does not answer clearly, permits both readings, suggests that the tension itself might be what matters, that we should neither fully embrace unity nor fully embrace fragmentation, but live thoughtfully in the space between. The reflection touches technology as well. Artificial intelligence promises to perfect translation, to eliminate linguistic barriers entirely, to create practical unity without requiring everyone to speak the same language. Is this healing of Babel or circumventing its wisdom? If God desired diversity, does technological translation honour that desire by preserving languages while enabling communication, or violate it by removing the friction that diversity creates, the necessity of real learning and cultural engagement that machine translation might let us avoid? The reflection must include political dimensions. Nationalism and globalism battle for cultural allegiance, one emphasising difference and particular identity, the other emphasising commonality and universal humanity. Both claim moral authority, both see the other as dangerous, both use Babel to support their positions. Nationalists say the scattering proves that distinct peoples with distinct languages are natural and good, that attempting global unity is impious hubris. Globalists say the scattering was punishment for pride but not ideal, that we should work toward unity while avoiding the arrogance that caused judgment. Who is right? Or is the question itself misframed, assuming single answer where the story offers complexity? The reflection becomes personal when we consider our own identities. We are all multilingual now, not necessarily in speaking multiple languages, but in code switching between contexts, presenting different selves in different situations, participating in multiple communities with different norms and vocabularies. We are scattered within ourselves, fragmented across roles and relationships in ways that would be impossible in truly unified society. Is this alienation or authenticity? Are we losing coherent identity, or discovering that coherent identity was always illusion, that humans have always been multiple, have always spoken different languages to different audiences, have always resisted the unity that social pressure tries to impose? What Babel means for us, ultimately, is that the questions it raises are permanent questions, not problems to be solved, but tensions to be navigated, not errors to be corrected, but conditions to be accepted. We will always want both unity and diversity, will always build towers knowing they will fall, will always scatter and then try to gather again, will always speak multiple languages while dreaming of speaking one. This is not failure of understanding but the human condition itself, and the story preserves this truth not to make us despair, but to help us accept, to stop fighting against our nature, to find peace in the paradox. The reflection, in the end, is invitation to humility, to recognise that we do not know better than our ancestors, that our towers are not stronger than theirs, that our unity is not more permanent, that our confusion is not more solvable. To accept that diversity is not problem but reality, that fragmentation is not failure but feature, that the languages will remain confused and the peoples will remain scattered, and this is how it should be, how it must be, how God intended it despite what empire and ideology and technology keep trying to achieve. In this reflection, in this moment of stillness before we return to the noise of our own tower building, perhaps we can hear what the story has been saying all along. Let it go. Let the unity go. Let the dream of single language and single name and single tower go. Accept the scattering. Embrace the confusion. Find the blessing that has always been hiding in the curse, the gift that has always been wrapped in the punishment, the wisdom that speaks not in one voice, but in the multitude of voices that humanity actually is. The sun sets over the Iraqi desert, casting long shadows across the plain where Babylon once stood. The ruins are quiet now, the tourists gone for the day, the archaeologists finished with their measurements and photographs, leaving only the wind and the lengthening darkness and the ghosts of empires that rose from this earth and returned to it. Somewhere beneath the sand and scrub grass lies the foundation of Etemenanki, the tower that may or may not have been Babel, the structure that inspired a story that has outlasted the structure itself by millennia. The bricks are still there, some of them, weathered and cracked, but bearing still the stamp of Nebuchadnezzar, the cuneiform characters that proclaimed his name and his piety and his ambition to reach heaven through architectural achievement. Those bricks remember, in their way, the hands that shaped them, the workers who stacked them, the priests who consecrated them, the kings who commanded them. They remember the dream of unity, the vision of a tower so high that all humanity would gather in its shadow, would speak its language, would make its name immortal. But the bricks also remember the fall, the slow erosion, that began the moment construction ceased, the inexorable return to dust that awaits all human work regardless of how grand, how well built, how thoroughly intended to last forever. They remember Alexander's failed promise to rebuild, remember the Persian and Greek and Parthian and Roman soldiers who camped among the ruins, remember the Islamic armies that swept through and built new cities from the old bricks. Remember the centuries of sand accumulating, covering, forgetting, until only a mound remained to mark where glory had stood. The story endures differently, not in stone but in the more permanent medium of human memory, of texts copied and recopied, of narratives told and retold, of meanings that shift and multiply while the core remains recognizable. The Tower of Babel lives in Jewish tradition and Christian theology, in Islamic commentary and secular scholarship, in art and literature and political theory and linguistic science. It lives wherever people gather to build something ambitious, and someone asks whether this tower will stand, whether unity is worth its cost, whether height is the same as righteousness. The legacy is paradoxical, as perhaps it must be. The story that warned against building towers has inspired countless artistic depictions of towers, has made Babel one of the most frequently illustrated biblical narratives. The story that celebrated linguistic diversity has been used to justify linguistic imperialism, to argue that confusion should be overcome through imposed unity. The story that scattered peoples has been interpreted as prophecy of eventual gathering, of restoration, of unity recovered through divine intervention rather than human effort. Every interpretation contradicts some other interpretation, yet all draw from the same source, the same 11 verses, the same ancient memory of a tower that reached toward heaven and fell back to earth. The legacy lives in every skyscraper, every monument, every building that draws the eye upward and makes observers tilt their heads back and wonder at human capability. The architects do not think about Babel consciously, probably do not design with ancient warnings in mind, but the echo's there nonetheless. The tallest buildings in the world, the Burj Khalifa and the Shanghai Tower and whatever will be built next to claim the record, they are all Babel's children, all attempts to touch the sky, all demonstrations that humanity has not learned or has decided that the lesson does not apply, that this time will be different. The legacy lives in the United Nations, in the European Union, in every international organization that tries to coordinate diverse peoples, speaking diverse languages toward common goals. The translators working in their soundproof booths, simultaneously interpreting between Arabic and English and French and Chinese and Spanish and Russian, they are managing Babel daily, creating temporary unity through the labor of translation, proving that, Coordination is possible without eliminating diversity, but also that coordination is difficult, expensive, always imperfect, always vulnerable to misunderstanding and miscommunication. The legacy lives in the internet, in social media platforms where billions of people connect across linguistic and cultural boundaries, where machine translation enables communication that would otherwise be impossible, where global conversation happens in real time despite participants speaking different languages. But the legacy also lives in the way these platforms fragment as much as unify, create echo chambers and filter bubbles, enable groups to organize in opposition to each other, demonstrate that connection is not the same as understanding, that speaking to each other is not the same as speaking with each other. The legacy lives most powerfully, perhaps, in the questions that will not go away, that each generation must answer anew. Should we build high or build humble? Should we seek unity or celebrate diversity? Should we try to speak one language or preserve many? Should we gather in cities or scatter across the land? Should we make names for ourselves or accept anonymity? Should we reach for heaven or tend the earth? These are not questions with fixed answers, but questions that define what it means to be human, that we must keep asking even knowing that our answers will be provisional, that the next generation will answer differently, that the tower will fall and be rebuilt and fall again in endless cycle. As darkness completes its claim on the desert, as the last light fades from the western horizon, the ruins of Babylon settle into silence. But the story does not settle, cannot settle, will not settle, until the last human voice falls silent, until the last tower crumbles, until the last language is forgotten. The Tower of Babel endures not in stone but in memory, not in height but in depth, not in unity but in the endless diverse interpretations it generates, each valid, each limited, each contributing to understanding that no single perspective can contain. The legacy is this: we are scattered, we are confused, we speak many languages and build many towers, and this is not failure but humanity, not curse but reality, not problem but the condition within which we must find meaning, create beauty, love each other despite and because of our differences. The tower fell, the lesson remains, the story continues. And somewhere in the Iraqi desert, in the silent ruins where Babylon once reached toward heaven, the bricks remember and the sand covers, and the wind whispers the same message it has whispered for 4,000 years. Everything built will fall, but the stories endure.